Hello, everyone. We're so glad that you are with us. It is right at the bottom of the hour. We're going to give it around 60 seconds to make sure that everybody is logged in, and we'll be underway. We're so glad to have you with us. Well, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, as the case may be, depending on your location. Today is a day that we have really been looking forward to, an event that we know is going to be very special. We're so glad that you could be with us. My name is Dan Worry. I am the Senior Director of Early Learning for the Hunt Institute, which is an education policy resource to America's governors and state lawmakers and other senior state elected leaders. We're located in Cary, North Carolina, just outside of Raleigh. And over the next 2 hours, we are going to be joined really by a pretty amazing array of resource experts. This is sort of a jumbo-sized webinar for us. We'll span 2 hours and have an amazing set of panelists, really kind of 3 panels in one today, to discuss not only the importance of diversity and inclusion in early childhood settings, but really what policymakers can do to help to create and sustain and promote these kinds of inclusive early childhood settings. You know, just 2 years from now, in 2024, we will be marking the 70th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, which is, I'm sure you know, is the Supreme Court's landmark anti-segregation ruling. And no question, over the decades, the nation has significantly diversified its educational programs. But what we often fail to acknowledge is that American preschool classrooms remain really among the nation's least diverse settings, often concentrating children with similar racial and ethnic and especially socioeconomic characteristics into classrooms that, according to a recent report from the Urban Institute, are more than twice as likely than their counterparts in kindergarten and first grade even to be 100% Black or Hispanic. Meanwhile, the nation's public policy investments here, with all good intentions, may actually be promoting socioeconomic segregation by targeting publicly funded programs almost exclusively to low-income children. But the evidence here suggests that diverse and inclusive classrooms yield very important results and outcomes for all children. They improve their language abilities, they improve their social emotional development, and have been shown to demonstrate a range of improved academic outcomes, all coming from the participation in diverse and inclusive settings. So to explore these issues, we at the Hunt Institute have been delighted to partner over the past year with some amazing colleagues, the Education Trust, the Century Foundation, and Educational Alliance's Manny Cantor Center, which is an amazing community center and preschool on Manhattan's Lower East Side. And the result is something that we are very excited to share with you today, a new issue brief that went live this morning on the Hunt Institute website called Strong Foundations, Promoting Diverse and Inclusive Preschool Settings. We'll drop the link to that report in the chat. But again, it is live on the Hunt Institute's website if you look under resources, and it looks at the value of diversity and the outcomes that it has been shown to produce. It spotlights some fantastic preschool programs, including our partners from the Manny Cantor Center, who you'll be hearing from in a little while, and concludes with some recommendations for policymakers on this front. And that's actually just the format that we're going to follow over the next 2 hours. As I mentioned, for those of you who have joined us in past broadcasts, we typically have a panel of resource experts. Today, we actually have 3 panels sort of combined into one, and so we'll rotate through those. But that's sort of the flow of the day. I should make clear up front that both the report And our conversation today really defined diversity in its many forms. This includes certainly racial and ethnic diversity, socioeconomic diversity, which I've referred to, but also things like native language and the inclusion of children with disabilities, just to name a few. Of course, this work would not have been possible without one very important partner, and that is the Trust for Learning, which helped us to underwrite this project across all of the partner organizations. And so as we kick off today, I want to take a few minutes to introduce you to Ellen Roche, who serves as the Executive Director at Trust for Learning, for a few opening remarks. Ellen.
Dan, thank you. I'm just going to echo a few things that you said and welcome everyone. My name is Ellen Roche. I work at Trust for Learning. We are a philanthropic partnership, and our mission is to support ideal learning environments for every child, birth through 8, regardless of setting. So over the years, we have worked with an incredible group of experts to articulate core principles of ideal learning environments. We think about play and relationships, how the environment supports adult development. But the first and foundational principle of ideal learning environments for kids is a commitment to equity. We think about racial equity, socioeconomic equity, linguistic and cultural equity, supporting kids with disabilities and special needs. So I am so thrilled about this event, which has been a long time coming. The brief is fabulous. I got a chance to read it, and it just synthesizes so beautifully the data on the harm caused by current disparities, the data on the benefits for kids when we can do the difficult adult work of bringing together kids in programs. And what I'm so excited about for this event is that we're really focused on solutions. Partners who you're going to hear from soon have actually done this in their centers. We've got policymakers and think tank people and researchers. So I am just so excited to sit back and absorb and learn and take notes, and to continue to be an ally in this work. So thank you, Dan. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, just very excited.
Ellen, thank you. And we want to take a moment as well to recognize Chris Ann Gale, who has been an amazing partner throughout this work at Trust for Learning. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to join us as well to be a part of today's event, but a fantastic partner and a thought leader in this process as well. So why don't we kick things off? Before I introduce the first panel, want to just mention a couple of housekeeping items. The first of which is, and I see that it is already happening, we'd love for you to use the chat. Jump in there, make relationships with one another. It's always exciting to me to see just how many, sort of the geographic diversity included. And in fact, it's not uncommon that we have participants even from outside the United States on some of these events. So please do take a moment, introduce yourself, let us know where you are from, have a conversation in the chat as we are going along. But we would ask that you not place questions for the panelists in the chat, because as you can see, it moves quickly. There's a lot of conversation in there already. If you have a question that you'd like to pose to the panel, we are going to try to take time all throughout today's event to try to prioritize getting to some of those questions, but would ask that you use the Q&A function down at the bottom and sort of separate the two there. You chat in the chat and then make your formal question in the Q&A so that we can sort of sort through and easily identify where those questions are. The other thing I wanted to mention, as we always do, the Hunt Institute has prioritized closed captioning all of these events, and so if that is a service that would be helpful to you, you can find the closed captioning controls down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and invite you to turn those on and take advantage of them. So with that, why don't we transition? As I mentioned, we're gonna sort of break today's conversation into 3 chunks. I think the first, broadly talking about the importance and the value of diversity at a high level in early childhood settings. The second, as Ellen mentioned, we're gonna take a little bit of a deeper dive into how this is working in practice in an amazing preschool setting in New York City at the Manny Cantor Center. And then we will close out the day with a conversation among the thought partners in this new report: the Century Foundation, the Education Trust, the Educational Alliance, which is Manny Cantor's umbrella organization, and us certainly here at the Hunt Institute. So that's sort of a little bit about the flow of the day. And with that, I want to introduce and invite to turn on their cameras as well, Dr. Ioma Aruka, who is the founding director of the Equity Research Action Coalition and a faculty fellow at the University of North Carolina's Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute. Yvette Sanchez Fuentes, who is the Vice President of National Policy at Start Early. Some of you who have been around the field for a while know that Yvette is also the former director of the Federal Office of Head Start. And Dr. Keisha Daniels, who is an assistant professor of the practice of education down the road from the Hunt Institute at Duke University. So we are so glad to have all three of you, and thank you for taking time out of your schedule. Dr. Aruka, I want to begin with you. I say, as we tried a little bit to set the stage here as we were opening, talk to us a little bit about why diverse classmates matter for young children, and what do we know about the benefits of having diverse and inclusive preschool classrooms?
Thank you. Glad to have. I'm here with you all. I'm just glad to be here. So humbled to be here. I just want to say just to that, which is a really awesome question, a wonderful question to start the conversation, is I just want to remind us that we just celebrated Juneteenth, right? A time commemorating when enslaved Black people in Texas were finally told they were free. And I think to me, I bring that up just because we have to recognize that we still have a lot of ways to go, but it's also important to just recognize the importance of our rich history, shared history, both good and bad. And then just to get to your question about when I think about diversity, right? Of course, I think your report really nicely lays out the benefit of diversity. I want to make sure that we also recognize that diversity is not just to sort of say, for example, I grew up in Boston where, Black kids were bused to white neighborhoods. So I wanted to sort of think of diversity, not just about the transferring of sort of Black and brown bodies into white spaces, but also to think of it as sort of a beginning, right? And we should recognize that many Black and Latino and brown spaces are fine, right? Because they had to be, because they were not allowed to enter other spaces. So we have to at least remember that it's important that we recognize the richness of even monoracial places. However, I do think that diversity of children and classmates are critically important, but we have to actually focus on the diversity of the workforce, the curriculum, the resources, the assessments, because having diverse classmates is important. But if we don't change the fundamental sort of framing, the sort of, I will argue, white supremacy framing, then what it does is it continues to harm primarily Black children, Latino children, children with disabilities, children living in poor circumstances. So we have to make sure that we're not just talking about diversity in terms of just phenotypes, but also in terms of the actual underlying sort of space. And then once we address that underlying diversity, then I think we do think about the diversity of classmates, which I think is instrumental for global society. Like literally all of us are connecting with so many people across the globe. And as the census showed us, we now know that literally we're becoming more brown, right? We have more mixed racial, folks. We have more Latino, population. So we need to think about the browning of our country. And of course, for some people, it may make people feel nervous. But I would say that exposure is important, but really it's about creating those relationships and connections. And children's minds begin to think differently. They can solve world problems. We literally have world problem issues. And I'll just sort of end sort of my response to your question, just to sort of bring back, I love MLK. Like I love MLK. And I think everybody should read his book as one of their things they do. And I want to just read like one phrase that he talks about, which is like, this is a multiracial nation where all groups are dependent on each other, whether they want to recognize it or not, right? So I think that's important that we have to recognize that in the end of it, diversity is not just to help children, but it's also to help children as they continue through the life course and really begin to be part of the problem solvers, the presidents, the lawyers, the doctors, that the diversity in of itself is not what the issue is that we have to create diversity that's also integrated in the heart and the mind and the spirit of our children.
Yeah, well, thank you. As always, fantastic opening comments and just so much richness to think about there. Yvette, I want to bring you into the conversation again. You are the Vice President of National Policy at Start Early, and also have had this amazing experience at the Federal Office of Head Start. I referenced early on, and I think Ioma sort of raised in her opening comments as well. This is all very much impacted by policy. And that in many cases that, it may be that, even very well intended policies, for example, the income targeting that programs like Head Start, that were created with the purpose of reaching, at-risk children, may actually be maybe inadvertently contributing to this lack of diversity in these preschool classrooms. So talk to us a little bit about how the nation's preschool investments may play a role in kind of promoting or even hindering classroom diversity during the early childhood years, and what do we need to be thinking about to better ensure diversity and inclusivity in enrollment?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Dan, for the invitation, and just thank you all for joining today. And I'm so humbled to be here with all of these amazing folks. Yeah, I think Dr. Ioma and Dan, y'all hit it right on the nail on the head. Right, these programs were designed more than 50 years ago. We know that the programs were designed with a very specific purpose in mind. And while some would say that at the time they were designed okay, right? They sort of met their goal. It's been more than 50 years, and we have not fundamentally changed anything from a policy or a regulations perspective about how our programs are run at the national level. I think there's a lot of reasons for that, right? We know that just overall programs are underfunded. There's a lot of challenges just with the workforce, and we have to focus on those things as well. But aside from the funding, there hasn't really been any fundamental shift in how we think about the design of our federally funded programs, both Head Start and the Child Care Development Block Grant. And then that obviously impacts how then states decide how they're going to design their models. And then that impacts how communities ultimately have flexibility and leverage to design their programs, right? And so I do think as we move into thinking and planning for the future, we have to really have a shift in how we think about what these programs look like. Funding is obviously a very important piece, and I agree with many of my colleagues that we should be focused on funding. But as we're thinking about that funding, we should also be working to think about how do we fundamentally change the way that we design our programs. And I think there is fear there. So I think, Dr. Ioma said it, like there is some fear there because we're worried about losing ours and who's going to get what. But I do think that if we can do it in the space of early childhood, then anybody can do it. But we do need to sit down and have those conversations about what has to fundamentally change in our policies, in our regulations, and how these programs were initially designed so that we can then support states and we can support communities to be able to have the flexibility and the funding that they need to design programs that meet the needs of their communities. So I'll stop there because I know we're going to have a discussion about all this.
Absolutely. Thank you, Yvette. And Keisha, I want to bring you into the conversation now. Ioma did a wonderful job of sort of setting the stage for us on just how multidimensional this is. This isn't only about sort of diversity among classroom peers. It gets into other aspects of policy as well. And one area that we know that you have done some amazing work here recently, in fact, we're excited to be publishing some of it at the Hunt Institute, is around the importance of a diverse teacher workforce, and some of that work has really, I know been K-12 focused, but I think very much sort of the same issue here. Why is it important? Talk to us about why it's important to that students have exposure to adults that not only reflect their own background, but really the full diversity of our population.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dan. And I'm so pleased to be here with my other panelists. Yeah, so my work is largely on the other end after you all do your amazing work with preschoolers and preschool education. But sort of just tapping back into what Dan said initially at the very beginning is it is one system, right? We like to sometimes separate the pre-K experience from the K-12 experience, but it has always been my work to include pre-K-12 and higher ed. And I think that's one of the main reasons why we see that there is a connection And this conversation has to connect to what happens in the K-12 spaces. And so the benefits are great. And Dan, you mentioned them earlier, specifically for grade levels, K-12, there's a lot of research now that supports not only the benefits to all students, and I'll come back to a point that Dr. Iruka mentioned around thought leadership and thought partnership. But in terms of thinking about the benefits across the board for all students, we know that there are academic gains amongst all students when they have a diverse teaching population. My work has largely focused on increasing diversity through the lens of Black and Brown teachers, specifically male Black teachers or male Hispanic and Latino teachers. However, I would be remiss if I didn't recognize that diversity is so much larger than that, obviously, and we're looking for our Asian and Asian American teachers as well, our Native Indigenous teachers as well, Pacific Islanders, right? The scope is large. But most of my work is around increasing Black and Brown teachers in spaces, since we do know that unlike pre-K classrooms across K-12 in public spaces are more Brown and Black. They just are, and they will continue to be, and we know this. However, the teaching population has not met the same growth expansion. And so the benefits, particularly for Black children in public school spaces, is that we know if a Black student has at least 3 teachers who look like them, and again, I don't want to forget about the relationships part, because that's huge, right? So it's not just that they have teachers who look like them, it's that they have teachers who look like them and have built relationships with them so that they know they feel welcome in spaces. And so if a Black student, particularly Black male students, have at least 3 Black teachers before 3rd grade, they are 40% more likely to graduate from high school. I'm going to let that sink in for a minute. That is huge, right? As well, longitudinal studies show that when following those same students that have had at least 3 Black teachers before 3rd grade, the chances are increased that they will not only graduate from high school, but that they will go on to apply and get accepted to college and universities, and then also graduate. So not only does the high school graduation increase, right, but also to go on to other higher education afterward. And so that's huge, that's really big. The other point I'll make is that we also know that more African-American teachers and Latino teachers see the greatness and the potential of our African-American and Latino children in regards to AIG services, so academically and intellectually gifted services. More Black and Brown children are recommended for AIG programming by teachers who look like them. And so just those 2 huge impacts really can change the scope of who we see in higher education, who we have out in the field in STEM careers. And so there's this ripple effect that takes place when we focus on increasing teacher diversity along with thought leadership, right? Because when we've got more ideas at the table, we're going to be able to look at kids differently and say, sure, that child absolutely can do rigorous work in an AIG classroom. That student can absolutely go on to college. And so I think that there are many different ways to look at it, but there are only gains. So we need to spend a little bit more time focusing on increasing teacher diversity in the K-12 spaces.
Dr. Daniels, thank you so much, and want to stress, the similar outcomes, as we have sketched out across this new issue brief that was released this morning. the benefits are accruing to very young children as well across multiple different domains of their of their development, and improvements in their language skills, improvement in social emotional development, improvement in cognitive development, all traced back to participation in really diverse and inclusive programs. Dr. Aruka, I want to give you a chance to, with your work more specifically in early childhood, wanted to at least acknowledge too that, it seems in some ways that we have kind of maybe two flips, the flip side of the coin in some ways in the early childhood workforce, which is, in many cases, women of color who are, in many cases, particularly in the nation's childcare settings, terrifically poorly compensated. What are your thoughts on the workforce within early childhood settings in particular?
So, I would say to, especially the childcare workforce, for those who don't understand, it's the childcare. I still think of it as a bifurcated system, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have your childcare, you have your pre-K, and you may have obviously Head Start, early Head Start. But in the childcare, where you're talking about our friend and family neighbor care, our home-based care, center-based care. They're doing omens work. Like, is that the word, right? Like, you're asking primarily women. And obviously we know from our data from Berkeley, there's probably talking about 45-50% of Black women, Latina women who have immigration status. Like, so we're talking about a diverse array of women who are being asked to basically subsidize our country. Basically, which means I'm going to take a job that pays me about $11.94. Now, we've seen inflation, we've seen gas prices. We say, take this $11.94, work 80 hours, and we hope you can sort of put food on the table. And we know that that is literally unfair, right? And so we're asking these women, and of course we have obviously, again, a large number of women as well. So we're asking these primarily women to do all this work and take the low pay, and also do this great work of building brains. That's literally what we're asking people to do. And so I think, as much as, again, my mother's a school teacher, I say that on purpose now in Boston. And I say this because it's like, it's really amazing work to get educators into the space, because exactly to Dr. Daniel's point, right? That diverse teachers are really important for Black kids, Latino kids, and white kids. Like, I want to make sure people understand, right? That diversity is not just about, let's make sure those Black and brown kids do better. Yes, we should do that. But it's also beneficial for white kids, right? They get to think differently. We are a global society. If you've never met a brown person, a Latino person, a Black person, and you meet them when you are 35, that is going to be a problem to solve climate change, to solve the racial issues, to solve the global warfare that we're probably going to be in forever. So I think we need to also really understand that it's not just you're giving pity to Black people, brown people, Latino people, those who speak a different language. We need to understand this is a benefit for our collective society to thrive. And so for me, I wanted to recognize that. And I would say, if we're trying to really do what our children need and to really promote sort of diverse settings, again, I would sort of, I think, underscore that we should promote diversity, but I think in many ways really sort of lean into, like, we desegregated, even though that's going backwards. We never actually integrated. That is the part that we actually never did, right? So again, I want to say, yes, we can have monoracial places that are thriving, and we should commend them for thriving, but integration is really what we need to sort of move forward to. And the only way to do those kind of things is to figure out, how do we make sure that this system, including early care education, some of them were not really created for our Black people, for our Latino people, our Asian, our Native people whose first language is not English, right? It wasn't created in that way. And so even if early learning is probably more holistic than, say, arguably K-12, I think we need to make sure that our to create this diverse but really more integrated and sort of sustainable sort of preschool setting, we need to begin to explore all of the assets of our families. They come with dreams, they come with sort of goals, they come with ideas, they come with brilliance that we have to recognize. We need to make sure that we have expectations that really says that, we are proactively engaging and supporting all families, recognizing again that the system literally was created to actually bar certain groups from actually being fully educated. So I think we have to make sure that we're really cognizant about our history, but even today, how it's still actually limited access for many people of color. And then finally, I do think that we have to continue to sort of really educate people that we can create spaces and try to create sort of a diverse mind. And again, MLK talks about multiracial society building, but we have to remember that we have to educate ourselves about how we need to continue to sort of push on our workforce to continue to do better, but push on our leadership to really recognize the importance of a diverse leadership. Now, again, we still know that even in early care education, we do still have primarily white leaders and white systems. Again, not across the board, but we still have to think about the diversity of our leadership, because when you have a diverse leadership, it sends a message to our workforce. It sends a message to our children that, you know what, people who are Black, who are brown, who speak different languages, who have weird names like Ioma, that they can also be leaders in this space. And the more that children see themselves as leaders, the more that they can dream and be free. So I want us to really be really intentional about the importance of children seeing different groups of kids who don't look like them, sound like them, live like them, but also the importance of what we show them, because it tells them the ability to dream and think better and think bigger.
Absolutely. Yoma, every time you speak, I feel like I need to pause for a moment just to sort of take it all in. But I will continue.
And I talk so fast, so thank you.
Our conversation. Yvette, I want to return to this question. You know, Head Start is a great example, right? So 50 years ago, I mean, here's a strategy that was created really in the name of equity, right? We're looking at how to take and provide opportunities for low-income children in particular, who may not otherwise have been exposed to the kinds of preschool opportunities, for example, that some of their wealthier counterparts may have been exposed to. What advice would you give to policymakers? Because I think this is true of Head Start. I think this is true of state pre-K programs that are income targeted. What advice would you give to those policymakers who are hoping to meet the needs and create kind of a more level playing field, in particular for low-income children, without creating entirely homogeneous or even kind of segregated classroom settings?
Yeah, I feel like I also just have to pause after hearing Dr. Ioma and Dr. Daniels, because I'm like, oh my goodness. So I'm just going to acknowledge that, because that's what's happening in the chat. So I feel like I just want to put that out there for everybody. Yeah, I mean, so for me, like what it really hits to is that I think ultimately the programs were created long ago, right, for the time and to solve a very specific issue. But I think if we sort of really, I'm feeling inspired here, go back to our history, right? There is a reason why Head Start was created the way it was created, right? There was a very specific goal around focusing on low income children and families in very targeted communities. And that continues today. And I think even though while at the local level, communities have really done their best to try to blend and braid funds and bring it from other places in order to create more inclusive spaces, the rules around our programs are very specific and they're really tight, right? And we want programs to be accountable because it's taxpayer dollars, but we also want to be able to provide funding that provide some flexibility for programs. And we have to go back and think about the rules and the regulations, right? And the policy that has actually pushed programs to continue to do the same things that we've been doing for 50 years with some slight changes, right? I would also say that one of the important things to note is that early care and education and childcare in this country is not a public good, right? K-12 is a public good. Services under 5, not a public good. And so we know that some states are trying to change their constitutions to make early care and education a public good, but like that, it feels like that really needs to start to happen, right, at the national level, so that we can actually acknowledge that kids and families are important to us. The other thing I would just say, and this is something that we're really doing at Start Early, is that we all have, good intentions and good ideas around changing policy, but it's so critical to make sure that we are actually listening to our parents and our professionals about what are the challenges. And then it's our job to take what they say to us and translate that into the policy that we then need to move forward to influence and change. And so I definitely always appreciate all of my colleagues at the state and the federal level. But I think, and I'm guilty of this. Many of us have our ideas, right? I have a lot of ideas about how I want to change Head Start, but maybe like they're not the right ideas. Maybe they're not the things I should be thinking about, because those are not the things that are impacting our parents and our professionals. And so really wanting to like take a step back and co-create and give up some of our power in the policy space to our parents and our professionals take that responsibility, translate it, and move the policy that we know is going to impact them first and foremost.
Thank you. I want to transition here into some of the questions from the viewers. And so if you've got a question, we've got a couple minutes left with this particular panel before we transition. And so please do feel free to drop them into the Q&A. Dr. Daniels, a question in the Q&A for you that I think speaks to where we began this conversation about the teacher workforce. Can you share some strategies? What are states doing, or what might they be doing to better recruit and retain teachers of color in particular?
Yeah, so, I hear you. Like, Yvette, when you were sharing, I was thinking to myself, yep, this is going to come around again. I think part of where there are three distinct areas I really feel that we could focus on to further think through all of these challenges, not just at the K-12 level, but also in the early childhood spaces. And so I feel like we always talk about this pipeline, and I do believe that the pipeline needs to first and foremost perhaps be cemented in the spaces where there are cracks, because a lot of our really amazing, thoughtful teachers for both the early childhood spaces and K-12 spaces, somewhere along that pipeline, they fall right through the cracks, and we allow them to fall, and we don't pick them back up and shuttle them in other places in these pipelines. So I think that there should be funding support to cement those pipelines. One of the questions that came up in the chat, which I think is really important, is thinking through, across the country in very rural areas, perhaps where there's not a lot of racial diversity and or ethnic diversity. What do we do to usher in, teachers in those spaces as well, diverse teachers in those spaces? So one of the, I think, really important opportunities that we have is for funding collaborations across IHEs, Institutes of Higher Education, in thinking how much more innovative we could be if we didn't live in EPP, early preparation program silos, right? So typically, and I feel like, I'm at one of the greatest universities ever, but we tend to, teacher prep programs work in silos. And so perhaps thinking through this idea that this is everyone's responsibility to educate and train and diversify teacher workforces across pre-K-12. Why aren't we more innovative and collaborative to think about how we can pull resources together to support the greater good, right? So this understanding that ECE programs are not the public greater good or not fall under that. Well, let's change that narrative and let's make it a part, because they're all of our kids and they're all of our teachers. And so it only makes sense. I think another untapped opportunity is more collaboration with HBCUs. HBCUs train and recruit and graduate more diverse candidates than any other universities. And so why aren't we tapping into their expertise and having them help all of us in figuring out how can we cement these pipelines and create more innovative programs? So certainly funding should go to helping schools talk across programming. And then the last thing that I'll add too is I feel like we haven't done a good job across the board with making sure that we have wraparound funding sources for anyone who wants to be a teacher. And that is anyone who wants to be a teacher, either in the early childhood space or the K-12 space. And so what would that look like? The potential is endless, but the funding has to be there. This idea that we know teachers across the board are not paid at the rate that they should be, right? Compensation and benefits. And so knowing that, let's put more opportunity and effort to give them the resources while they are growing and learning their craft. So this could look like, if you want to be a teacher, then you get paid internship, student teaching internship experience, residency experience from the beginning. And then after you graduate, you're no longer a pre-service teacher, now you're an in-service teacher. Let's figure out innovative ways to support you so that you actually don't have to go in debt to do something that you love. And so there are a lot of different models that support the wraparound afterward for in-service teachers when we know that's when we lose them, right? Those 3 years out, we want to keep them. And so there are programs like at Duke, we have Teach House, which is a living learning community for in-service teachers. You can work in an early childhood setting, you could work in a K-12 setting, but the idea that we're going to support you while you are doing the hardest job in the world, right? Not just support for thought leadership, but also funding support so that you can thrive in your job and in your community. So I see those as being three distinct areas where funding at states and policymakers could really spend a little bit more effort.
Dr. Daniels, thank you. Dr. Aruka, I want to go and give you a moment to weigh in there as well.
You must have saw me typing, Jen. I was going to say, I could not, I ditto everything that Dr. Cantor said. I will also add that in many ways, obviously with the HBCUs, somebody asked, yes, historically Black college universities, but also we have a lot of Hispanic serving institutions as HSIs and also MSIs, minority serving institutions. And North Carolina has one of the many number of both HSIs, but also HBCUs in this whole entire country. So I could not agree with that more. The other thing I do think we have to be really blunt about is that our teachers are being asked to be a whole lot. We're asking them to be the policeman. We're asking them to be the clinician, to be the therapist. Again, my mother was a teacher, right? And so, of course, we recognize that the value of teachers because they see our kids for 8 to 10 hours. But I think we have to also recognize that we have to protect them and provide the resources for their own mental health, along with obviously adequate compensation. But we have to protect them for what is clearly, we're in a sort of a cultural war, and we're asking teachers to sort of do all of this. So I think we have to make sure that we're also making sure that our teachers also know how to be good teachers, particularly to our Black, Latina, Native, Asian children, other children of color, and other children who speak a different language. We must expect for them to, if you're going to be a teacher with all of this, we have to recognize you have to know our history. You have to know how do you reach children who literally are usually not taught or thought about. How do we change the curriculum to make sure that you generate information, even if it's not in your textbook, that's probably wrong. So I think in many ways, as we do our training of our educators, let's make sure that they have the right facts and they can reach all of our children in ways that are meaningful, that are not harmful, but really support their identity, whoever they are, and also that supports their assets in many ways. So that's what I'm hoping, that we ask our teachers to do a lot, but we also pay them what they deserve.
Yvette, we're winding down on time. I knew we'd be able to. We could talk to this panel alone for 2 hours. I know, Yvette, but I want to give you a final word here. Anything that Doctors Aruka and Daniels have raised that you want to weigh in on?
I guess I would just say that folks should make their voices heard, right? And I saw like a quick question around how do we negotiate all of the priorities, but ultimately I think, we need to hear from parents and professionals about what it is that they need. And then those of us who do policy at the state and federal level, we need to listen to that and move those pieces forward. So I would encourage people to be inspired by this and make their voices heard about what it is that they need.
Fantastic. Well, thanks to all three of you for joining at least this initial part of the conversation. We're not done, but I know we're gonna transition to the next part of the conversation. So Dr. Ielma Aruka of the University of North Carolina, Yvette Sanchez Fuentes of Start Early, and Dr. Keisha Daniels of Duke University. Thanks to all three of you for what a powerful way to open this conversation, and hope we can invite all three of you back maybe to continue this as it looks like the great response in the chat as well. So thanks to all three of you. At this point, we are going to, I will continue to encourage you to use the Q&A for the questions that you may have, so that we can distinguish those from those that may be raised in the chat. But the next thing we wanted to do as part of the agenda today was to actually drill down a little bit deeper and spotlight a preschool program that is actually walking the walk when it comes to inclusion and diversity. So I want to invite all of our friends from the Manny Cantor Center to come on camera with me and I will introduce you to some amazing, amazing colleagues. Let me pull up. There we go. Now I can see you all. So want to, first off, and I'll let them do a much better introduction, but the Manny Cantor Center is located on Manhattan. Yes.
So sorry, I can't turn my video on. Is there a way you can enable that for me?
I don't know if I can, but let me.
I can't turn mine on.
We just did it.
Oh,
Thank you.
there we go.
Thanks, sorry to interrupt. Hi.
See you now. So the Manny Cantor Center is on Manhattan's Lower East Side and is an amazing resource to the community there that has, over the past couple of years, managed to transition what was maybe an outdated way of delivering some of their preschool programming into something that is truly integrated and diverse in important ways. And so I want to introduce you to Jamie Davidson Craig, who is the executive director there of the Manny Cantor Center, along with Jacqueline Marks, who is the Senior Director of Early Childhood, Jason Rodriguez, who is the Director of Business and Finance, which is a very important part of this conversation and making this happen, and also to Debbie Yu, who is a pre-K teacher there at Manny Cantor. It's so great to see all of you, and thanks for not only for joining us today, but for your contributions to this work over the past year. Some of you viewing may know we actually the first step in this process, even prior to today's release, was that we held a fantastic event about a month ago at the Manny Cantor Center and sort of focused in on this as it looks in practice in New York City. And we were so delighted to be hosted there at Manny Cantor. Jamie, want to begin with you and give you an opportunity maybe to set the stage a little bit. Tell us a little bit about the center, who it serves, where it is, and help us lay the groundwork a little bit.
Of course. Great. Thanks, Dan. And I just want to echo your sentiments around the convening that we hosted at Manny Cantor. It was such an energizing and exciting time for us to have, so many folks there who were really engaged in the topic and really invested in improving the quality of our early childhood experiences and making our schools as diverse as they ought to be. So thank you. And I hope we can do it again at the end of it. We all were sort of putting our minds together around how we could make it bigger and better next year, and thought about perhaps doing school visits and things of the like. So look out for that, because I think that there's cool stuff ahead. So great, thank you. So the Manny Cantor Center, just to back up, we are a community center that's located on the Lower East Side. We are a community center that houses a number of services for the community. So we have a preschool, we have older adult programming where we serve about 150 meals to older adults every day. We have a teen center. We have a tuition-based art school that offers scholarships as well. We have a fitness center, and we have the FRC, or Family Resource Center, which is a 2-gen model, a one-stop shop support service community where families can access mental health support and counseling. We have everything from workforce development to legal aid to support around tax prep, and the list goes on and on. When the baby formula shortage hit, the FRC responded immediately to make sure that our early childhood families and community, our neighbors in the community, didn't, were able to access formula. So, the FRC, and we will talk about the FRC, I think, a little bit as it relates to early childhood, is really a powerful sort of a powerful piece of the Manny Cantor Center. So we at MCC are diverse by design. We live at the intersection of, and literally geographically, we live at the intersection of a public housing community, of Chinatown, and of these brand new housing developments with multi-million-dollar condos. The center and the preschool are diverse by design. And I think that what we are doing here at Manny Cantor is extremely powerful and is truly transformative. And I say that with I say that with a tremendous amount of humility because I just got here 4 months ago. So I'm just so honored to be part of the work, to be honest. I'm still pinching myself that I get to be part of the work with all of these amazing people who I think are, quite frankly, creating a new model for how we bring communities together in meaningful ways and celebrate the diversity that that comes with bringing communities together. Before I was at Manny Cantor, my background is in education. So I taught 5th grade, I was a reading specialist, and I was a middle school principal. And in teaching in New York City, I will say that, every single day I went to school, it made me wonder what we were doing here as a country. New York City, as many of you know, as many of you may know, is one of our most segregated school districts in the whole country. I would teach books, teach historical fiction novels about the 1940s and 50s in the South and talk about what it was like for Black and brown kids to go to segregated schools every day and look around and see that schools were still segregated. It is a travesty, and it is a world, and it is not the world that I want my son to grow up in. So walking into Manny Cantor every day and seeing the incredible things that are happening in our early childhood center with such a beautiful, diverse array of kids and families who come from a really wide range of backgrounds, both in terms of economic, race, culturally, geographically. It is emblematic of the world that I would like to live in one day, and certainly of the world that I think that all of us here are trying to create. And it truly, it starts in preschool. So, I'm not going to take up too much more of the time, because I think that the crux of what you'll learn in this panel is really how the work is done. And it is done by my incredible colleagues, Jacqueline Marks, our director, who shepherded this model from the very start into fruition and made it what it is today. Jason Rodriguez, who very much did the same and is the mastermind behind all of the funding. And I do not use the word mastermind lightly. It's pretty incredible the way that he was able to navigate our 3 funding sources so that we can really make this work. And Debbie, where the work actually happens. So I already talked longer than I wanted to. I'm eager to hear from them.
Great. Well, let's bring Jacqueline into the conversation. Thank you, Jamie. And Jacqueline, obviously we are lifting up the Manny Cantor Center today as a real life example of how preschool programs really can be thoughtfully diversified. But I know that this was a process for the school. You arrived at this place by having to do some rethinking of prior practices, but also, as Jamie has sort of alluded to, reconfiguring around various different rules and regulations and funding streams that in some cases may complicate schools' efforts to do that. So, I want you to tell the story, but obviously, previously you operated sort of 2 separate preschool programs there in the building, and have managed in recent years to bring that together into kind of one unified program. Tell us a little bit about the program, the history, and the changes that you have made there at the center.
Sure thing. Thanks so much, Dan, for the invitation to be here. I feel very humble, actually, to have the opportunity, or I feel humbled to have the opportunity to speak about our school. It is quite an incredible place, and as both you and Jamie alluded to, it hasn't always been in the iteration that it is now. It's always been incredible, but different. And so what I wanted to start by talking about is just the fact that in New York City in particular, and many cities across the world, across the country, and I mean, I guess the world too, right? But across our country in particular, there's de facto segregation. And this was alluded to in the earlier panel, because there is no public good for early childhood or for any care from, you know, infancy through age 5. It doesn't exist. And currently, what that looks like is early childhood is based on a family's ability to pay or to meet eligibility requirements for public programs. And so what that does is it sets up, you know, a system that is separate. It is not equal. And, you know, however many years past Brown v. Board of Ed, we're still struggling with many of the same problems. And so here at the Manny Cantor Center, like many of you, we began to wonder why it was set up this way. And as Jamie described, in particular at our community center, which previously housed both types of programs, a tuition-based progressive preschool and a Head Start and early Head Start funded school with very strong social work supports set side by side in the same building. Jason has our building as its background, so you can kind of imagine, you know, children and families entering. But if you pushed 2 on the elevator button or you pushed 3, it actually meant that you came from families of very different backgrounds, and you were going into a school that had that was very different. There were 2 separate schools with different leadership structures, different philosophies, different teachers. And it was just a stark reminder every single morning about the inequality and the separation that existed, not just in our city, but in our center in particular. And so what we did was set out on a path to discover why it was this way, and then with a goal to impart change. So the first thing that we did as we set out in this journey was to unpack the lore that existed. And the main lore, there was much, but the biggest crux of the lore was that our funders would not allow it. And Jason will speak to, to the back end in a bit. But that was really the heart of it, was funders wouldn't allow it. And so, you know, funders wouldn't allow it, and therefore this isn't a conversation that could even be entered into. And so what we did was we set out to have conversations with our funders, to speak to folks from Federal Head Start, to speak to folks at the Department of Education, and begin to unpack this lore. And what we did learn actually is that it was possible. It was possible to have blended classrooms, and to incorporate many different types of funding. What we did hear along the way, though, was a lot of doubt. Our funders wondered why we would want to do that. Particularly because it would make the finances really difficult. So while it was possible, they wondered why we would want to do that. That's another whole panel. Perhaps that's what the first panel was addressing, right, is the systemic problem here. But for us, what we heard was that little crack, right, that crack opening that led to yes, this is possible. There is a way, there is a path forward. And so we heard that opening and we leaned in. From there, we sought to understand the teacher and family perspectives about this opportunity to integrate our schools together. On the family side, what was happening was at each time I gave a tour to our school, families wondered about the classroom over there or the classroom over there, or why are the classrooms or the programs separate? It was confusing not only to us internally, but it was confusing to the families in our neighborhood as to why the programs were separated. And those tours actually became more uncomfortable, and began to hear both from families coming for tours and families who were in our school that they did in fact want to be together. Our community, our neighborhood is incredibly diverse, socioeconomically diverse, racially diverse, linguistically, culturally. It is an incredibly diverse community, and everyone here in the community wanted to be together in one school. So at that point, you know, we heard from the family side that we did have buy-in there. And then from there, we had our teachers. And this was really the most sensitive one that we needed to handle. And I'm so glad that Debbie has agreed to join this panel to speak to her experience, because for us, we did have this experience where there were two schools with two separate philosophies. As I described, one more traditional Head Start funded program with very deep family engagement and social work support, and one progressive tuition-based preschool that was lauded for its work on co-constructed curriculum and progressive education. And so what we sought to do actually was to, as we thought about the integration, take the best of what each school had to offer. So the progressive nature of the curriculum and the strength of the social work support, which then led to the creation of the Family Resource Center, which Jamie alluded to earlier. And so what we did with our teachers was have lots of conversations about what existed, what we wanted to create together. And it was agreed actually by our teaching community that of course this was necessary and a step that our school and community needed to take, and that we needed to do this in partnership and relationship together. And so we began small. We started with joint sing-alongs and shared professional development. We then moved on to integrate at the UPK level, so the 4 and 5-year-old level, for all 4-year-olds to have time together. Debbie was actually part of that inaugural year when we first came together in that way. And then we had a 5-year plan that over the next 5 years, you know, our infants would have an integrated classroom. And then from there, it would go, the infants would become toddlers, toddlers would become twos, threes, and we would have a fully integrated school over several years. Then it was 2020. And I say that actually with a smile, because in our case, we were left amidst this global pandemic with a huge opportunity. What was possible, or what we were faced with actually, was the potential to have 2 under-enrolled schools and not enough teachers in either school to run either program. And so never one to lose an opportunity or a great struggle, we launched amidst a global pandemic a fully integrated school in September 2020. So while all of us were locked inside from March to September, afraid of what was to come, and you know, many families and teachers and everyone actually struggling from the effects of the pandemic, we were working very, very hard to figure out how we could reopen as one whole integrated school. There's much more to say, of course, but I'll say just one more thing, which is that as I look back on that first year, our first year together, as a fully integrated school, I think the most important thing to note actually is that it was a very smooth year in terms of the school logistics and families being together and teachers being together. Sure, there were tons of problems, but those were problems that every school across the country was facing, right? That's masking and quarantines and guidelines and the regulations and all of those things. Those were the things that we were worrying about, just like everyone else, but worrying about them together. From the teacher perspective, the family perspective, the child perspective, we were together as one school, and it felt just right. So
that's amazing.
Thank you.
Jacqueline, thank you. And Debbie, why don't let's bring you into the conversation. Jacqueline has sort of traced out sort of the evolution of the program, and now the integration into, you know, kind of one unified program there at Manny Cantor. Talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing as a teacher. What do you see as the benefits maybe to the children and families that you're serving from this integrated approach?
Yeah, I think for me, I've seen the integration have a clear impact on our community. As Jacqueline mentioned, I started at Manny Cantor the first year our UPK program was integrated. And it was actually the reason why I chose to work here. You know, talking with Jacqueline during the hiring process, you envision these children who had seen each other in the hallways for years, just passing by one another and really just forming their own assumptions of why they're being kept separate. And now they're going to get to share a physical space together for the first time. So it just seemed like an amazing opportunity to witness children from diverse ethnic, financial, religious, cultural backgrounds coming together to form relationships and get to explore their world and share their perspectives with one another. And, it's a beautiful vision and a necessary one to work towards, but in reality, it didn't just happen because we put all the children in the same room. So being in the classroom at the beginning of the year, I saw a clear divide in who the children chose to play with. Children coming from the private preschool who were predominantly Jewish and had been together for 3 years before chose to play together. And then children coming from our Head Start programs who happened to be mainly children from Chinese families would stay together. And this is the sad reality for a lot of our city, that schools and children are segregated. So walking into that environment, I'm realizing I have the chance to change this and have the children connect with one another. So the question became, how do I try to do this so that we don't have just two groups of children coexisting in the same space? And what's really great about our school is that we follow an emergent curriculum, which is driven by the children's interests, knowledge, and curiosities. And children are naturally curious about others in their environment, and they share their observations with us. So as they made comments about their similarities and differences, I really worked to weave in identity exploration into our curriculum work in a natural way. The children had questions like, why are you saying that, when they heard children speak different languages? Why are you talking like that? Because children communicate in different ways, verbally and non-verbally. Why is your hair this color, this texture? Why do you live with your grandparents? Why don't you have a dad? And these are questions that can be very uncomfortable. And I know I was, being put in that situation. Growing up, I asked these questions, and I remember my parents, my teachers kind of just brushing them off. And I was conditioned to feel that these are things that we just don't talk about. So as an educator, but also as a human, it was incredibly hard to push myself to create a space where we just had open discussions about these things. And we worked really hard to have our families become our partners in this new exploratory work. We invited them into our classrooms to teach us their home languages and to share their traditions and rituals that they practice at home with us. And what we saw was children feeling more comfortable to share their questions and thoughts about their home lives. And as we explored our identities with them, the children no longer focused solely on their differences, but now that we are talking about our differences and learning not only to respect them, but also that they should be celebrated, the children became more inclusive in their play and their work, and they formed friendships based on shared interests and their personalities. And this wasn't contained only to the children, but we saw it cross over to the families as well. So I would say it hasn't been easy, and it's definitely been uncomfortable at times, but the integration has had a really positive effect on not only the children, but our families and staff as well. And I think it's a continued learning process that's going to be very rewarding, and it's innovative, and I'm just excited to continue this work.
Debbie, thank you, and thank you for being here. I know, and for stepping out of your classroom as well. I know it's always hard to get away. As a former kindergarten teacher myself, I know both the challenge, but also what a fantastic opportunity. Your kids are so lucky to have you, and thank you for joining the panel today. I want to bring Jason Rodriguez into the conversation. Jason described you as the mastermind, and that, I think on a practical level, that's what, I think people need to hear more, because we lack a unified early childhood system. And so what we end up with is, we've got all of these various different funding streams, each with their own independent requirements and regulations that in some cases, not only don't match one another, but don't even speak to one another or acknowledge the existence of one another. And so, the challenge is just making it all work. So talk to us a little bit about how did you undertake this process in practice of figuring out how to blend all of these various different requirements and funding streams to make one integrated program there at Manny Cantor?
So I think the beauty of what you just mentioned is we need to have a unified early childhood space, and not just unified in spaces that we're hosting amongst each other, but also creating platforms for our funders to also have conversations and come together, right? Because in order to just even begin this conversation is really like breaking it down, right? So we've mentioned blending a few times. So in the brief that went out, there are two different definitions. There is blending funding and braiding funding. What we have traditionally done in the past in early childhood has been blending programming, right? What we are doing now at Manny Cantor Center is that we are braiding funding, right? So I'm going to describe a little bit of the difference there, right? Because then that's going to really help how to really formulate what the approach is. So when you're blending funding, this directly from the excerpt, refers to funds from two separate funding sources wrapped together within one full workday. When you blend funds, costs are not necessarily allocated or tracked by individual funding sources, right? That's the easy way out, right? Because what you're saying is, okay, we have a Head Start program that is a Head Start classroom. All the children in that classroom are Head Start children, all the staff in that classroom are Head Start staff. So all the revenue and expenses are only going to send to Head Start, right? That's what blending means. But if we are understanding that we need to integrate our program to get to the rate per child that we need to provide the adequate services, we need to actually braid our funding, right? And braiding funding refers to funds from two or more funding sources coordinated to support the cost of services for children, right? That's an important difference. To coordinate what is the cost of services for children. We have identified that it costs us to provide services for children $38,000 per child, right? So we are looking at all times for a fiscal year, how do we get to $38,000 of revenue per child in our school, right? Because that allows us to do some of the other recommendations that are in the brief, and I'll touch base a little bit as I move on. What are some of the areas that we're allowed to do because we're braiding our resources? So when you're braiding your resources, you need to make sure that your costs are charged and shared appropriately to the program and what those administrative areas are, right? So my role traditionally would not exist in an early childhood program, right? I am the director for our business and finance for a school, and I don't sit on our finance team. I sit on the program level. You usually have a finance person that sits on the finance team, right? And your program is usually engaging with the accountant, right? The accountant doesn't have knowledge of your program, right? The accountant has knowledge of what you tell that person, and then they follow and have you go through the internal control systems that the finance team is going to have just to make sure that they're in compliance. But they're not going to really be your thought partner on how you're going to actually leverage your resources, where you're putting it, and what's actually allowed, right? I sit at that intersection between finance and program. I am a program person that sits on the team that has finance experience, and I am not just an accountant for the program leadership. I am essentially like the right hand for the program, right? I need to be involved in every single decision that's being made to an extent, right? Because I'm going to then be the person that's going to then do the day-to-day allocations. Every single expense that comes into our program, right now I have about 10 to 12 different templates. Any single expense that comes to the program, I am then the person that's saying, okay, to my operations person, you're going to charge this expense and you're going to use this template. You're going to charge this expense and you're going to use this template. On a month-by-month basis, we do allocations for all of our staff, right? So what I'm saying is it is labor intensive, but if you want to get to the end goal where you're providing these support services and wraparound services for your teams, you're going to need to make that investment in order to be able to make it through the clear, right? So because it's not just about promoting mixed delivery systems on the front end. For example, what does Head Start want in a classroom? What does DOE want in a classroom? And where do the two meet? And what are the conversations that are happening? Is that what are your next steps, right? So I'm going to give you a little bit some more information as to what our program actually looks like. So we're projecting about $10 million of revenue for our early childhood and FRC program for next year, right? Of that, we're saying that about 57% is federal Head Start revenue. Approximately 17% of that is State Department of Education revenue, right? About 13% of that is private tuition money, and about 9% of that is foundation money, right? So there is no way that we're going to get to a $38,000 per child rate, right? If the DOE is giving you, this is not actual numbers, right? If the DOE is giving you approximately, let's say $15,000 per child, and Head Start is maybe giving you $12,000 per child, and then you might have some foundation money that's coming in that might be giving you about $5,000 per child. right? So it's important for you to acknowledge that you need, in order to deliver this kind of a mixed system, you need to braid your different revenue streams. So I just gave a foundation, right? You need to understand that you need to actually integrate all these items, and then you need to build an internal partnership to really make it happen, because I'm essentially making allocation decisions on a day-by-day basis. Every single day, I'm making decisions as to what should go where, right? So that's why it's very important that you have these partnerships built. Now, what does this allow you to do? There are still challenges, right? Because you're now, internally, you're used to now these systems, but every funder that you're bringing into your ecosystem, it's really like you're also teaching and you're being an advocate. So I am a big believer that we should be bringing people into our spaces, which is why I love that we brought our group together into our actual facilities recently, and that we're having this conversation, because the more that we are teaching each other, the more that we're able to then help each other out. And so that funders can also understand. So for example, the DOE might be giving you money to provide a support for a certain child. They actually want to know, where is their money going? How are you spending their money, and where are you putting it? Right, so let's use, for example, if I have a braided classroom for our 3s and 4s, which is where we braid our UPK money and our 3K money with Head Start, and I'm saying that, how are we breaking up the percentages in that classroom? Right now, we're breaking up 70% DOE and 30% Head Start because of our enrollment numbers in that classroom. So as the business person in our classroom, I know exactly how many children are in each classroom, what their eligibility is, where their funding stream is coming. Then I know what the square footage in that classroom, and then I've split it up appropriately there, right? Not trying to scare anybody, but that is the level of detail that you're going to need to have when you're grading your funding, so that when your auditors are coming out, which, because they're going to come out to look at your records, because they know that now you are really doing all this braided funding. So we just finished having our Head Start Focus Area 2 review. And one of the specific areas that the reviewer was asking us about is, please explain us your allocation methodology, because the central office has told us that you are braiding programming, right? So when the auditors are coming out to your program, because now they know that you're braiding, and now they're going to be paying extra attention to your items. But that's okay. Like, I welcome, come look at my books, because if I'm spending almost every single day looking at them to make sure that we're providing this quality of services, then I'm okay with you looking at my books, because I'm making sure that I'm using the proper allocation methodology, right? And then you need to be able to build the appropriate partners with the organizations that are also going to believe in what you're doing. That might be a little bit harder when the majority of your revenue is probably coming from a Head Start contract or a DOE contract, but you have leeway when you're building partnerships with foundations. So our two biggest partners from the foundation world are the Tiger Foundation and O'Neill Foundation, right? And they're really interested in what we're incubating in our school and what we're growing, right? So they're aware of what are some of the resources that we need, and they really give us flexible funding so that then we can then, plug into the gaps that we might have, right? So, okay, Head Start might only allow us to spend certain money on this end, but now with Tiger money, we can maybe plug in and get some more supports on certain areas. So that's why it's important that you're having these conversations and are being continuous with everybody around you. Now, what does this allow us to do, right? Some of our recommendations are promoting a mixed delivery system, right? Expanding inclusive preschool programming, right? We're saying that because by expanding it, then you're going to get more revenue, right? What's also going to happen is, if you're really integrating a lot of different programs, is you're going to need to develop comprehensive training and professional development, right? By combining revenue streams, we have been able this year to inject about $65,000 of money into professional development for our staff, right? Meaning that 98% of our staff this year have participated in professional development. Professional development has to be continuous, because if you're putting multiple programming in one classroom, then everyone also needs to understand what the programming is, right? We also want to make our place also exciting and competitive. What we have also been able to do this past year is we have been able to inject about $600,000 into our staff to really address compensation and needs of early childhood staff, right? And the only reason why we're able to do that as well is because we're blending different forms of programming, right? So yes, the complexity is challenging at the front end, But what you get on the back end is beautiful, because then you have the resources to do the things that in the early childhood environment we usually don't get a chance to. If our brief is saying that only 50% of the early childhood community is engaged in programming, that means there's another 50% of early childhood students out there that need programming. So there is space right now to be very robust in expanding early childhood, right? I'm going to steal a quote from Yvette from the earlier panel, where she said that we need to start thinking outside of the box as to what our program structure should look like. What we have done at Manny Cantor Center is that we don't care what you've told us that you want us to do. We're saying this is the model that we want to do. And we have found a way to make it work. Yes, it's been challenging, but the back end is very promising. And we look very forward to continuing to share our challenges, because we've definitely had them, our successes, and where our areas of opportunities. And I'll stay quiet for a second to see if Dan wants me to say anything else.
Jason, I don't know. I'm guessing you haven't had a chance to sort of follow along in the chat as you've been speaking, but I've had the opportunity to kind of look through and just to see how many of the viewers are commenting about how exciting and how helpful this is to really see an example of how this can be done. It's no question, it's very complex. And really takes the right spirit and expertise. I have to say I'm so intrigued, even by sort of the role of your position there at Manny Cantor, this connection, because I think in almost every program I have experienced, I mean, there's this sort of hard divide between program and finance in a way that, frankly, takes something complex and makes it almost impossible to solve. And so, that you have this programmatic connection and this financial expertise seems to me like maybe it's one of the determining factors in really making the difference. So, in the interest of time, I want to suggest two things, because we do have one more panel, and I want to make sure that all of the partners have the opportunity to discuss the report a little bit. But I am wondering, and I think I know the answer to this, but you all can weigh in the chat. I wonder if maybe we don't need to host sort of a more intimate conversation where maybe viewers could participate on camera and do a little bit of Q&A, maybe with Jason and Jacqueline, for example, folks that are looking maybe at how to do this and really have some specific questions. Maybe we can have a follow-up conversation, because boy, it sure looks like there is a need. And I'm seeing, thank you, Sabrina, definitely seeing interest in the chat, because this is, as I mentioned earlier with the other chat, I do feel like this is each of these three panels we could take multiple hours to sort of unpack. So with that, why don't we pause? Although I will say, Manny Cantor friends, as one of the four key partners in this conversation over the past year, definitely invite you, not only to stay with us, but to stay on camera as you'd like, and to participate here in the closing conversation. But understand, and Debbie, I certainly understand if you need to go. I suspect there is a sub in your classroom who's wondering why you weren't back 10 minutes ago already. So with that, why don't we transition to sort of the final aspect of the panel today? And I want to invite our final panelists to kind of join us on camera at this point, and we can launch into a conversation now about the report itself. I want to introduce you to Dr. Carrie Gillespie, who is a senior P12 research associate at the Education Trust, Dr. Connor Williams of the Century Foundation, and Elizabeth Bird, who is director of public policy at Educational Alliance, which is the umbrella organization under which Manny Cantor operates. It's so great to have all of you here today, and I know you all share the excitement of finally the release of this report today. I don't expect, as we've said with these prior panels, we won't begin to be able to scratch the surface of every detail and recommendation that you all who are watching today will be able to find in the report, but definitely want to open up a conversation. And maybe Elizabeth, we can start with you from Educational Alliance's perspective. Jason did a great job of sort of laying out the importance of all of these different funding streams and mixed delivery. And a lot of the report, sort of gets into this question of not only the need for increased funding, but more innovative ways of looking at funding and incorporating mixed delivery. So maybe talk a little bit from your perspective there at Educational Alliance about the need for those things, for innovative funding and for mixed delivery.
Yeah, I think this has been such a great series of panels, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak a little bit. I would just definitely build on everything that Jason has been talking about. I do want to just back up briefly just to say that I think part of this exists now in a landscape of a little bit of a culture shift where we are as a nation starting to really recognize the value of early care and education, particularly as localities are moving towards establishing universal pre-K programs. And certainly in the course of the pandemic, I think there's been more of a cultural awakening how critical early care is for birth to 3 in terms of providing a support to our workforce and our economy, as well as laying a fundamental driver of equity for childhood outcomes. So understanding the value is one thing, but actually providing consistent funding for high quality early care and education is really the next step. And that's why I think this report has really been so fundamental and valuable, despite understanding what the landscape is in terms of the need for early care and education. We don't have real robust mechanisms for financing that. So as we're starting to think about it, I would just put out there, like, innovative funding needs to start with establishing consistent benchmarks of quality. And as this report and these panels have all established, you cannot have quality without diversity. That needs to be fundamentally built into the way we think about policies around early care and education. And I think that the issue brief, makes a really compelling argument for that. I would say that this funding mechanisms that cover the cost of high quality care, that is the other point that I think needs to be underscored here. As Jason, went into the gory details of what it really costs, the true cost of providing such a high quality program that is extended to all families, regardless of their ability to pay. This is sort of a model for where I think we and where I would hope policymakers are trending towards. So thinking about providing care for families, for providers, providing funding that works for families and providers, and includes a well-compensated workforce as well.
Elizabeth, thank you. Carrie, I want to let you jump in. Any thoughts you want to share on the question of financing and funding?
Yes. Hi there. Thank you so much for having me. I've learned so much already during this webinar. Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything that's been said. And one thing that I would add is that I completely agree. We need much, much more robust funding at every level for early learning. And although the interest is there, it takes much more political will for it to happen. Also, as we say at Education Trust a lot, it's not just about how much funding there is, but how well it's used. And so that really requires thoughtful planning at the beginning of things, getting input from everyone involved, from families, from teachers, from communities, from researchers, planning out what data to collect, what research to do, and how to monitor how funding is used so that we know that we're getting, our bang for the buck. So it's both how much funding and how well it's used that's really, really important. And a big part of that, of course, is being able to see whether or how funds are distributed equitably among all the different settings across this mixed delivery system. Are different providers getting equitable amounts of funding? and being able to really look at the program level, how those funds are used. And I want to be clear that I don't mean to put this on educators and staff in the buildings. This is on the systems. This is on the state and federal and district level to be able to track this and keep track of it and give providers resources on how to use these funds in ways that providers want to use them and feel are most useful, rather than just kind of saying this is exactly what needs to be done with these funds and leaving it at that.
Connor, I want to give you an opportunity to jump in. Anything you want to add on the financing front?
Sure. One thing I would say is someone who had 2 kids who've gone through and 1 kid who's about to start the public pre-K program here in Washington, D.C. As I think most folks will know, our system is pretty heavily school-based and not so much a mixed delivery system in pre-K. And so my biases are at least partly shaped by that anecdotal, really excellent experience. So I would just echo what I think everyone said so far, that I think that the strengths of the mixed delivery model are pretty obvious and are manifold. The challenge is to make sure that a mixed delivery system doesn't become a multiple tier system, right? Where the resources made available to one tier aren't identical or equitably shared with other tiers, and that those resources don't then lead to different tiers of quality. And frankly, maybe as important as anything in a choice-based system, when we're trying to foster diverse settings, that they don't lead to perceived differences in prestige, right? That if there are differential amounts of resources being made available and differential quality metrics being published, and then you have parents of different levels of privilege and socioeconomic status choosing based on that perceived information, you can very quickly resegregate along, especially in a choice-based system, along the different methods of mixed delivery.
I want to caution viewers, this across this report, we deal with so many, as I mentioned in the opening, so many different aspects of diversity, so many different ways of defining diversity. There's a lot to cover potentially here. So if we bounce around a little bit in these final 30 minutes, don't get too much whiplash. But I want to shift a little bit off of the financing topic and circle back to where we started a little bit, and thinking about Dr. Daniels' discussions about the teacher workforce in particular. Elizabeth, weigh in on what might policymakers do to help better equip us to have a diverse early childhood workforce?
Yeah, thank you. I thought that Dr. Daniels was amazing, and the ideas and policy recommendations that she touched on. I think this could be its own panel for sure. Obviously, the conversation has to start with compensation, with minimum of parity for compensation across all providers that is comparable with the compensation provided at K-3. When we're talking about early childhood education. But then I think that there's really a space here for our policymakers and our government leaders to be creative about thinking about apprenticeship programs, teacher residency programs, thinking about ways to collaborate with institutes of higher education, offer tuition incentives to really attract people into the workforce, pay for them to go, provide a stipend for them to go to school so that they are compensated during the time it takes for them to become highly qualified and trained professionals who are ready to work with young children. That is all part of building a high quality system. And I think also a system that is geared towards providing services to a diverse student population as well. I think I'll stop there. Oh, well, I did want to also mention that I think that it's also important that we touch on ways that we can make the profession really attractive to people who are entering the workforce, thinking about building in career ladders and lattices, so that there's a variety of career pathways within the early childhood care and education field that makes it a fulfilling career to enter and to hopefully stay in, because we have to acknowledge the fact that retention, particularly now as we are leaving this pandemic behind us, hopefully, workforce retention is now like astronomically more difficult than it was before.
Elizabeth, thank you. And Connor, I want to jump to you because I know you've got to drop off maybe a little bit before our conclusion today. One of the things that we haven't talked as much about today that I know you had some thoughts to share on is the needs of dual language learners. Talk a little bit about sort of what children and families need there, and then maybe to connect to what Elizabeth was just talking about in terms of the workforce, how that plays into workforce challenges as well for maybe non-English speaking or second language members of our workforce.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I do apologize. I've got to jump off in about 15 minutes, but this is one of those moments. This is the focus of my work at the Century Foundations is young dual language learners and older English learning students. And this is that moment where I think like, oh my gosh, I have half an hour worth of things to say and maybe 2 minutes to do it. So I'll try to be as coherent as I can. A few things. I mean, just quick stats is that roughly a quarter of US children speak a non-English language at home. And in the under 5 years, the percentage is higher, as high perhaps as 30 or 35%. And so what do we know about this? We know that students who are linguistically diverse, who speak more than one language or who speak a non-English language at home, a couple of things. First of all, they are English learners when they show up in early childhood settings. That's true. But so is my 3-year-old, right? My 3-year-old has not mastered English, even though we speak English at home. And so that's why we call them dual language learners, because these students who are linguistically diverse, who are speaking non-English languages at home, they're bringing emerging language abilities in their home languages, and often some beginning or rudimentary or emerging language proficiencies in English as well. They're learning both languages at once, which is it's a big job for a 3-year-old. But the other good news we have is that the best way we know in the long run to support not just their emerging bilingualism, but also their academic development, their linguistic development, really everything for these students is to make sure that their home languages are supported, which is what links back to Elizabeth's answer a moment ago, right? Is that when we talk about teacher diversity, we always have to also talk about language diversity. Remember, we're looking at like nearly a third of kids in early childhood settings or in the early childhood years are linguistically diverse, or DLLs, dual language learners. To support their home languages, we need staff that can actually use those home languages optimally. And so then that can pose all kinds of challenges. This is one of these moments, I think, as a policy analyst, it's important to remember as a sort of bedrock principle that all good things do not inevitably go together. And what I mean by that is, you can imagine a relatively targeted, narrow solution about professionalizing the early childhood field, say, raise pay and raise credentials, or change the proxy credential we're going to use for determining quality for who gets to be an early childhood educator. And then you can also imagine that pretty targeted, focused push excluding a bunch of linguistically diverse candidates who are going to struggle to get their new credential that we've suddenly just foisted upon the field, right? Because they're non-traditional adult students, because we didn't build in supports to help them get in over the finish line on that. And so that's just to say that the laudable goal of raising credentials and raising training and raising pay, those three things may need to be sort of crosswalked to ensure that we don't do damage to teacher diversity as well. So all of that's to say then, let's assume though that we can solve these problems, and there's lots of good information in the report along these lines about some of the steps we need to start to make progress on that. The really exciting thing here is that what we have is a lot of good evidence, and I can prove to you, I have right here, one of my children, especially as we're late in the panel, like this is like the fireworks that get people to pay attention, who went to, and is still at actually the same school. She went to the pre-K program at a Title I dual language immersion school in our neighborhood. It's an extraordinary school. It's a wonderful place. It's also enrolls a roughly even numbers of Spanish dominant and English dominant students. The peer effects of those programs, literally the integration itself, the linguistic integration, are what make these programs work. That's to say that anybody who studied, say, Spanish in middle school here in the United States, if you're a native English speaker and you're sitting there memorizing verb tenses and vocabulary, it's deadening. It is a terrible way to learn a language. But if you are, I don't know, this boy Hugo in my daughter's pre-K class, and you really want to learn how to talk to this really adorable and brilliant and etc. girl, you got to learn some English to do it. And she had to learn some Spanish to talk to Hugo. The point being that the peer effects of having sort of a social world that is integrated and is linguistically diverse, it not only is beneficial to English dominant kids and privileged kids, socioeconomically privileged kids like my daughter, it's also beneficial to young dual language learners who get a chance to not just be learning English from their teacher, but to be learning English from the broader social world around them. So it's one of those, this was brilliant moments where dual language programs, especially in the early years, draw on like enormous numbers of different research consensus. We know that diverse early childhood settings are better for kids. We just know that. We also know that dual language programs are the best way for young DLLs to succeed. We further know that teaching settings in early childhood that have diverse identity matched teachers are really beneficial for young Latinx and linguistically diverse kids. I mean, it's on and on. We have so much evidence that linguistically diverse, bilingual education, dual language immersion programs are great early childhood programs, and not only for linguistically diverse kids.
That's fantastic. Connor, weigh in a little bit too on the workforce question. Talk about dual language teachers, and I know, you know, as training and credentialing requirements are passed by states, those don't always sync up well with the needs of those that are non-English speakers.
Oh, for sure. And I should have made that more explicit. I mean, when I was talking before about all good things not going together, this is one of the problems we absolutely have in the K-12 space, is that we have tons of evidence that the teacher licensure systems, the training systems, the certification systems that we have are really, really effective at keeping bilingual education or bilingual teacher training candidates out. They're really, really good at keeping non-native speakers of English from becoming licensed teachers. We also have very little evidence that they are effective means of producing high quality instruction. It's not as though they are really especially nuanced or sophisticated or careful ways to ensure that we get really high quality teachers in every classroom. And so there's been a lot of us who've been pushing, and this is in the report, right? It's the same in K-12 as in early ed, for different versions of grow your own models, cohort-based models, apprenticeship type or residency-based teacher training models that help people get provisional or just alternative certification that can allow them to be the linguistically diverse teachers that we need. And the data on this are just staggering. You know, remember that I said, right, a third or so of early childhood age kids and about a quarter of all kids under the age of 18 speak a non-English language at home. For teachers, it's only more like 1 in 10. It's just a much less linguistically diverse cohort, the adults who are actually in these classrooms, than the students who are being served. And then, of course, if you take that 1 in 10 teachers who is a native speaker of a non-English language, and say let's like remove anybody who's just a biology teacher who happens to speak German at home, or a Arabic teacher, a physics teacher who speaks Arabic at home. When you control down to the ones who might be able and willing and available to teach in bilingual settings, you're probably looking at more like 1 in 20. So there's just this immense need. Not to mention that, again, right, like, again, living proof, one of the exciting things we have in choice-based systems, both in K-12 and in early childhood, is that dual language is hot. The privileged, the socioeconomically privileged, the educationally privileged, the white English dominant communities, and a great many diverse communities are absolutely beating down the doors to get into these programs. It's one of these times where the value of diversity is so vivid in these settings that privileged families go out of their way to choose them, in fact, to a fault. And that's one other thing I should have said earlier. Just like solving one problem around credentialing and training can cause other ones around teacher diversity, creating new dual language immersion programs need to be done intentionally with an eye on equity to ensure that there are seats reserved for Spanish dominant kids or Korean dominant kids or Cantonese or Mandarin dominant kids, whichever language you're using, to make sure that the enthusiasm of people like me doesn't displace the DLLs that are in these settings.
Connor, thank you. Carrie, I want to jump to you. As I mentioned, the report, and again, I think we've put and we'll put back into the chat a link to the report released today that has so many specific recommendations for policymakers who are looking at this topic across all of its breadth. But I wanted to flag, some of those recommendations relate to the need for additional research, but also to really good, transparent data collection and the opportunity to look at this data. I think when we're talking about diversity in particular, we need solid data. to really be able to have this conversation. So I want to give you a moment to weigh in or a little bit on the questions around research and data. What do we need, and what might you recommend to policymakers on that front?
Well, it's a cliche, but it's very true that what gets measured gets done. So we just can't make constructive systemic changes without first knowing what the current situation is. And as hard as it is sometimes to figure that out in K-12, it's even harder in early childhood because of so many different players in the system. So early childhood data has a long way to go in being able to be quickly digested and analyzed in the ways where we can monitor and measure equity. So this means we have to be really intentional about the research that states and districts conduct and about the data that they're collecting and analyzing and publishing. Because as you say, transparency is very important throughout this whole process. So doing all of this planning and thinking through ideally should happen at the forefront of any research or policy change, rather than trying to analyze data that we've found that we have after the fact and kind of trying to put it together piecemeal. I know that's not always possible, but there are ways to do that. And again, whenever I talk about this stuff, like collecting data, I just want to be clear, this should not translate to a bigger burden on teachers and staff. It's on states and districts to make this less burdensome on teachers and staff when we're talking about collecting and reporting data. But so data for early childhood, as we talk about in the report, really has to be collected horizontally across all the different agencies and organizations and education settings where a child might go. For instance, often children go to more than one early learning setting in their day or in their week. And so being able to know that that's one child going to two different settings when we're thinking about child outcomes is really important, but it's really difficult in terms of collecting data. And then we also have to think about vertical systems. So can we have data on a child and how they're doing, or a program on and how it's doing over the course of a child's childhood, but even their lifetime, to see their long-term outcomes and try to analyze where there are opportunities to address policies and practices that could be improved. And then just the last thing I'll say is that when we're collecting all this data and when states are doing this research, the research has to be accessible to families, to communities, to educators. They have to be able to not only access it, but act on it. So it has to be actionable. It has to be clearly communicated. I would say it has to be communicated in several languages and several modes, with clear action steps of what's going to happen next or what can happen next based on these findings. And lastly, I would just say for research, what's really critical that hasn't always been done is bringing in all of the people that are involved in making preschool successful at the very beginning, getting input on the research design and the research questions and the data designs from teachers, from parents, from families, from community members, everyone who has a stake in the outcome of preschool. And so that means also talking to families of children with disabilities, families of children with dual language learners, just really being intentional from the get-go.
Carrie, thank you. We are winding down. We've only got about 10 minutes before our scheduled stop time, and I know this has been a marathon session. Want to take the last couple of minutes certainly to answer any questions that you have for the panel in the Q&A. So please do pop those into the Q&A at this point if you've got any outstanding. Before we do that, though, I wanted to ask Elizabeth. I think Manny Cantor is a wonderful example of a really diverse community and lots of different stakeholders, and that means meeting the needs of diverse families as well. Could you talk a little bit about how Education Alliance and how Manny Cantor go about engaging families in this important work?
That's a great question. I think particularly around family engagement, the early childhood at Manny Cantor is very intentional about rigorously pursuing families in a way to engage them in the activities that are happening in the classroom. And beyond the classroom, as Jamie alluded to, we also have a family resource center, which is also housed at the Manny Cantor Center, which is really a resource that is available to the entire community of the Lower East Side, staffed with social workers who are available to help connect families to whatever types of needs or resources might help them meet the needs that they are experiencing in that moment. I don't know if that sort of answers the question, but I do want to just emphasize the fact that I think part of what has made this this experience so successful is engaging families along the way, listening to their request really to have a more integrated and diverse program, being responsive to that request, and then following up with them along the way through surveys, through open forums, and engagement sessions where they can provide feedback, and using that as an opportunity to better tweak the program or make changes that can be responsive to families' needs.
I want to add something to that real quick. So highlighting the Family Resource Center, right? I'm getting really excited right now because the Family Resource Center for us this year, the Family Resource Center for us last year started as a pilot program, right? That was really primarily developed out of needs that we realized because of COVID in the community. And we really launched it to provide support services for our early childhood program. What we are doing now this year is we are trying to continue to grow in that capacity, right? So our Family Resource Center is going from a pilot program to a full-fledged program that will still be providing supports to our early childhood program, but will also now be engaging the overall general community as well, right? So not just being limited to providing services to our families or our tuition-paying families. We want to be able to provide these same wraparound holistic services to anybody that's walking across the street in our program, that just walks into Manny Cantor Center and is then saying, I need help, I'm about to get evicted, or I am experiencing food barriers, right? And what we have done this year is, I'll give you the financial strategy, right? So we have actually put about $1.2 million into the Family Resource Center this year, of which we are leveraging a good amount of our one-time grants that we got, right? So I know that a lot of organizations use their one-time grants. By one-time grants, I'm talking about American Rescue Plan, CARES Act, CRSA, the Child Care Stabilization Grant money that New York State gave out as well, right? So we are pouring a lot of those resources into our Family Resource Center. We understand that at the end of this year, those resources are gone, right? But in the effort of supporting increase in innovative funding, and to also gather research data and towards equity, we are saying that we're putting all of our chips on the table here. We're going after all this information. We're going to collect all as much data as we can, and then now we're going to use that data to go and find some more potential private money or things of that nature, so that we can continue to sustain to provide these level of services, right? We understand that sometimes our funding sources only give us money to provide direct services to our children, right? But in our brief, you are going to read that the children that are most likely to be engaged in an early childhood program are children that have families that have higher education levels and have work stability, right? So I'm tying it down, I'm tying it all over for you, Dan, right now, right? So if we are putting money into developing that capacity of our families, then we're going to then increase the capacity of engagement and getting and reaching out to that 50% of children that are not engaged in early childhood programs.
I'm just laughing at the chat. I want to forewarn Jamie and Elizabeth that Jason's getting job offers in the chat now at this point. So y'all better hold on to Jason. Our time is beginning to run down. A couple of questions though that I want to pull from the chat. One is whether there are resources available that are well suited to share within communities or accessible sort of to the general public to bring awareness to some of these issues on the benefits of diversity in these settings, I'm going to put in a shameless plug for the issue brief that was released today. It is certainly positioned very much, and thank you, Amanda, just dropped the link into the chat, certainly positioned very much as a resource for policymakers, and the final portion of the report really gets into some very specific detail on things that policymakers might do to help to support these diverse and inclusive settings. But it begins with, I think, a really nice overview of why this matters and what are the results that we have seen, and why might families ought to care about this. Certainly frame for why policymakers ought to care about it as well, but definitely encourage you to take a look at that report and access it. It is on the website today. It's been dropped into the chat on a number of different occasions. Maybe we'll wind down here. It looks like I think 2 hours is a long time to ask for a webinar, but maybe I'll come to each of you just for a very quick kind of closing thought on, if you could point to one thing that you would encourage policymakers to do to help better support diverse and inclusive preschool classrooms, what might that be? Elizabeth, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, this is great. I will say, and just reflective of all the love that Jason is getting in the chat right now, is one of the recommendations that I think is actually one of my favorite ones in the paper, which is that government agencies really can step up and act as a coordinator of revenue streams. Not every early childhood center or care provider has a Jason, and there's really an opportunity here for government to incentivize more diversity by taking some of the administrative burden off of providers when it comes to blending and braiding funding streams. It's not something that it is rocket science. It is actually very technical and difficult and requires pretty much a full-time, highly qualified professional capacity. And so I would just lift that up as something that I think I really value from this brief, and I think it was a huge takeaway for me.
Absolutely, and I think we'll definitely want to follow up. Jamie and Jason, I don't know if you're accessible, but if you have thoughts on a kind of a final wish for policymakers, would love to hear it. Jamie.
Oh gosh, that's tough. I think I would echo the importance of family partnership. And certainly the workforce development piece. I'm so proud of the educators that we have working at Educational Alliance, and fortunately for us, we have a number of Debbies. I pinch myself every day that that's the case, but it's certainly not the case everywhere, because we are not paying. We're not paying enough, we're not developing enough, and there isn't a meaningful pipeline. So I think the educator in me is to really pay attention to making sure that we have the right people in the classrooms for our kids.
Absolutely. Well, we are just about out of time, so I think maybe we'll wind up at this point. I want to again just sort of close with, first off, a very special and important word of thanks to Ellen and to Chris and Gail and to Trust for Learning for helping to bring all of this conversation together, the partnerships that we have created across our organizations and the work that we have done over the past year, bringing today's report to fruition, have been really valuable. And the relationships that have been built, I think I hope you will agree that the outcome, the issue brief that is out today, is useful and something that policymakers and others in the field are going to find useful. But that would not have happened but for Trust for Learning. So we are really grateful and want to just say our thanks again. I want to express my thanks certainly to Educational Alliance and to the great team at the Manny Cantor Center. What great innovative things are happening there, and we'll definitely want to follow up on how maybe we can have some more intimate conversations with folks who want to dig in a little bit deeper on some of these finance questions in particular. And then certainly to Education Trust, and to the Century Foundation as well. This has been a great partnership, and we are really appreciative of all the great work that went into this report. Hope that you'll access it. Go take a look at the website, download it today, and please feel free to share it around. We want it to reach as many readers as possible. So with that, again, thank you for taking the time out. I know 2 hours is a long time to be on Zoom, but boy, such great information. We could have gone on and on with some of these conversations. Thanks for being with us, and we look forward to talking with you again real soon. Thanks, everyone.